Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. We are firmly in my wheelhouse today, bitches. Right, Merrin is here today with me. Merrin's not a World War I historian, but she's very excited. Why are you excited, Merrin?
I am thrilled because a good friend of ours, Lucy Betteridge-Dyson, who is a military historian and well known to us, is going to talk to us about something that frightens the life out of me, but about which I should know a little bit more, and that's horses. Because as far as I'm concerned, horses are scary at both ends and dangerous in the middle. And Lucy, because she knows an awful lot about them and their uses in the First World War, is going to educate me. Aren't you, Lucy?
True.
I certainly hope so. I love that description, though.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Lucy Merrin is just like us in that she is refusing to live in the real world anymore and just wants to do history. And she's getting there, aren't you, Lucy?
Yes, I'm getting there. It's just at the horrible balancing stage of trying to do everying and not die bankrupt.
None of it. Right, okay. Let's start right at the beginning. And I'm going to let's try not to reference Warhorse with every one of these bloody answers as well. Especially where it rides down the middle of a very wide straight trench because everybody gets really angry. So let's suspend park Warhorse somewhere else because it's a kid's book, people. Park him up. Joey can fuck right off because we are going to talk actual horses and proper horses and their roles and the expansion of using them and all kinds of different things, which is really exciting. Where was the British Army at the outbreak of World War I? So how many horses did they have? Was it enough? And if not, what are the contingencies?
Yeah, so even the First World War, the British Army had about 25,000 horses, which was obviously nowhere near enough for the war that was to come, but pretty standard because obviously looking after horses takes a lot of resources, and so having like a massive load of horses kicking about doing nothing in peacetime would be a big drain. So, in general, armies kept it small, and all the major armies had a mobilization plan for horses because they all recognised that they were super important in war. And actually, Britain and Germany had kind of revamped these plans in the run-up to the First World War. Really, just like anything that was kind of going on in the precursor to the war, political tensions were high and all the rest of it. So they were looking at every element of how they could prepare and remount services. So, when we talk about remounts, we're literally re-upping the horses, adding more horses. So those plans were kind of both readdressed by the British and German armies, but they took different paths with it. So the British plan involved really more of an international effort. So their plans were based on access to the international horse market, whereas Germany's plans were very much based on increasing the number of horses within Germany, so breeding plans and that kind of thing. With the British, really, they chose the right approach, and it really served them well in the long run. So the first thing they did was they had like a kind of voluntary acquisition scheme, and you could register your horse, and the Army would pay you like a set fee a year to maintain your horse, keep it in good working order, one careful owner. And you get that money every year with the proviso that you would hand your horse over to the Army if they came knocking. And then they also had this conscription kind of scheme called impressment. And that was, really based on a pre-war census of horses that took place in 1911. And the army could, force you to give your horses up to the military. And they did both those things. And, I know you've already mentioned Warhorse, and we are going to mention it a bit today because I think like a lot of people's views on, horses in the First World War is based around that story, and the idea of, the military ploughing into all the villages and stripping them all their horses and leaving kids crying in the street because they took the ponies away.
And that's what happens in Warhorse, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what happens in Warhorse. And it's just not true. The countryside wasn't stripped of horses because horses were an integral part of life at the time. And had we stripped our country of horses, the home front would have collapsed because...
No food for a start.
Exactly. And I think it was one of those things like everything in the war, after the war, things were written, folklore kind of kicks in, doesn't it? And you hear about businesses that had all their horses taken. And actually you look at the records and it was like 2 of 8. were taken, and then they were replaced fairly quickly afterwards, with other remounts. But the British Horse Conscription Scheme, the impressment scheme worked really well, and the British Army raised 165,000 horses in just 12 days after war was declared, which was awesome. And the BEF was complete for remounts by the 18th of August. So that is pretty incredible. And when you put that in context of the fact that the horse population was around about 2.5 million in the UK, that gives you some idea of really how few horses were taken in those, that initial kind of bulk. So yeah, that kind of gives an idea of really the scale of it, which I think is often blown out of proportion.
And not all horses were suitable, surely, because when I think of horses, I think of Shire horses and Shetland ponies, and there's quite a big difference, isn't there?
Yeah,
they qualify which ones they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. And not all horses are created equal. And
although the thought of a cavalry charge on Shetland ponies makes me comfortable.
It'd be like Thelwell, wouldn't it? Little fat ponies.
Yeah. There's a Shetland Pony Grand National, and I always it's a joy to watch every year. You should totally choose that if you haven't seen it. But yeah, I mean, so the British Army had a bit of experience, obviously, with this. We learnt the hard way in the Boer War, where they kind of accepted any old horse going. And, you got South Africa, didn't treat them very well, didn't have time to acclimatise. They sent them out and they lasted, like a blink of an eye, and they all died, basically, and you had horrendous wastage figures. So actually going into the First World War, the British Army was super prepared. The Remount Commission had documentation, like 1911 types of horses suitable for remounts, and they would go around and they would thoroughly inspect their horses, check them over. They would all be veterinary checked, and they wouldn't accept anything. There were problems, so in Ireland in particular, because you can imagine as a farmer or whatever, you've got a couple of old nags that aren't doing that good work anymore, and the army's come around saying, oh, we'll pay you 20 quid for your horses or whatever, happy days,
This one's awesome, give me loads of money.
Exactly,
Yeah.
So people did do all kinds of things to try and get around that. So there's a problem in Ireland, also in Spain with mules. So we bought a lot of our mules from Spain, and there's like loads of accounts of the remount commissions when they visited all the little villages and stuff, of like people come around being like, this mule, and then they'd inspect it and they'd be like, no, not this mule, and then they'd just go out and come back round and they might have painted like a line on his, like a blaze on his face or something. This is a totally different mule. Like,
the blob of white paint on his face, I love it.
Yeah, so you had all this kind of stuff going on. People went to extremes. I mean, they even removed horses' teeth and stuff so that they couldn't be aged, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it wasn't a case of all horses were equal, and certainly the high quality horses really were what they were after.
And did whether they were shod, see, I know a technical term here, did whether they were shod or not factor in this, as in were they prepared?
No, so they wouldn't necessarily be ready to go. So all the horses would go to the remount depots, and they'd all be trained and, go through like a conditioning, a bit of training process. And particularly when the British Army, so one of the major advantages that Britain had is access to the international horse market, as I mentioned earlier. Something that Germany didn't have. And one of the big things, clever things that we did was actually agreed a process with America. So the majority of horses and mules that Britain used came from this huge equine market in America. America at the time had a population of about 30 million horses, and about 8 million of those were, kind of broken and trained. So having access to that pool was a massive advantage. And, the British were shipping over huge numbers. We spent around 36 million pounds throughout the war with America, just on horses and mules, which is a staggering amount.
And they came over in transports, in the holds? Or?
Yeah, it was a really, I mean, it's amazing to think about how the complexity of getting horses from all over the States. So the railroad, the infrastructure that needed to be put in place over there in the States, the remount depots, so they would be shipped to, collection pens where they'd be inspected by the British, and if they wanted them, they'd, you get branded with the broad arrow. And they'd then go to another depot further along where they'd be checked for disease, that kind of thing. and then they'd be loaded onto ships and taken back to, usually sometimes straight to the front, but most often to the UK. And you had around about a cargo of about 500 to 1,000 animals leaving the US every 1.5 days during.
That's a lot of pony. And as they sort of boarded the ship, were they already earmarked, as it were, for different jobs at the other end when they were offloaded? Did they know where they were going to send each pack of horses?
So your kind of battalions, or where the horses were needed, you put in your request for remounts basically, and then the remount department would sort out where they were coming from.
We talked about how they got them. Let's talk about what they did. Let's wind you up and get it out of the way. So all horses just went in the cavalry, right? That's where most of them went.
Yeah, that's right, Alex. No, that is not right.
It's not right. It's very wrong, and it makes me very angry.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess we kind of touched on it a bit, but it's, the horse in war is a particular goldmine for myths. I think because the horse has been in war with man, since man started fighting, basically, taking horses with us. Throw in all the, First World War, donkey, cavalry generals kind of nonsense, and you get this hot pot of just bullshit, basically.
What do you know what percentage of horses who served in World War One actually were ridden into battle as a trooper's horse?
I don't know the exact percentage.
Maybe not into battle, but in their units.
The cavalry was a very small part of the horse story in the First World War. It was a very, very small part. It's been blown up, really, I guess, because of things like war horse, or a lot of how the horse has been mythologized in film in the First World War is this kind of like, cavalry ploughing into machine gun fire and everyone getting slaughtered, which is obviously not true anyway in most of the occasions. Reality, the main jobs horses did was transport. The Royal Artillery, I mean, their horse establishment went up from something like 6,000 horses to 25,000 horses.
I mean, guns weigh a lot. You don't want, and the amount of men you'd need to jag. There are pictures of men dragging them along, but that is just a complete waste of resources when you can have a horse do it.
Yeah, exactly. And, when you think about the number of guns in a battery, batteries in a brigade, brigades in a division.
So six guns, right?
Yeah.
6 18-pounders, 3 batteries in a brigade, and brigades numbering over 300, up to 400.
400, yeah. So
soon mounts up, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's a small gun. That's a small gun. Then you've got the big ones. Then you've got the beast guns.
Yeah, and so when you think that's just moving, artillery about. That's one tiny, it's a big part, but it's a small part in a big story. And you kind of got all these things coming together, and they were involved in pretty much every aspect of the war. So yeah, of course we've got artillery guns. You think about that, you see the pictures of horses putting guns, but you've also got the dear old ASC, the Army Service Corps, unglamorous. We often forget about them. It's not something people really want to look into, I've found, but actually incredible work they did, and they relied on horses and mules, to get everything from ammunition to rations, anywhere in across all the fronts, relied on horses.
This is the thing, isn't it? So many of these fronts. So talk about, even on the Western Front, roads are inadequate for the scale of the war, but then move somewhere, I'm sure we'll come on to Palestine later, because their cavalry rocks it, because you're looking at huge wide open spaces, and you can't use a car, and lorries are at a premium anyway, so horses really are absolutely crucial, aren't they?
They're essential. And I think, again, we need to think about the period we're talking about here, where the combustion engine was pretty much in its infancy, and actually in day-to-day life relied on the horse, and okay, all right, on the front, you might have your light railway roads. Obviously, they were super important. But still, you look at like the wet and the mud of the Western Front. Ain't no trains crossing that. Ain't anything with an engine crossing that. And actually, as the war went on, fewer horses were crossing that, and the mules were what really came to the forefront. Which you knew I was going to mention mules at some point.
Always. So I was laughing my head off because I googled it. Ali Sloper's Cavalry, that's the nickname, isn't it, for Army Service Corps?
Yeah.
Talk about mules to people who don't know the difference. What is a mule and why are they different to horses?
Do you know what a mule is, Alex?
I think a mule is a cross between a horse and something else, a donkey, maybe.
Yeah, it is.
And they're smaller, and they're hard, they are nails. They're like, anything a horse goes, no, I'm not having that, a mule will do it, and a mule will like own it. And I know this from the kids magazine, the Great War Group, because our mascot is now Monty the Mule, and Rob Thompson, who the logistics king, who waffles incessantly about lines of communication and supply, is actually doing letters from Monty for the kids to read. So I'm learning from an 8-year-old's letter all about mules in the First World War.
As it should be. There weren't more mules than horses, but certainly towards the end of the war, and certainly 1917 on the Western Front, mules were really super important because, like you've said, you pretty much nailed it. So a mule is an offspring between a male donkey and a female horse, not the other way around. So that gives you a hinny, which is a different animal, bizarrely. And yeah, they are very, very nimble and they are very sure-footed. So that allows them to
climb mountains and stuff.
Yeah, they can pick through just like any kind of landscape, basically. And particularly important in the kind of, so that makes them great for like Palestine, all those kind of areas. But Western Front, when we're looking at the mud and the horrible conditions, mules are really hard, and they will put up with much tougher, much harsher conditions than horses will without getting sick. So that was a major benefit for them.
There's a guy on Mule Corps in Gallipoli as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there was, and Cypriot as well. And they are, the other thing about them is, they're so misunderstood, but they are super, super intelligent. They're more intelligent than a horse, arguably. And they have a kind of, there's been studies done on mules, where they've kind of reached the conclusions that they have cognitive ability to, and they're almost self-aware to see what's going to happen next in a situation. So this gives you an advantage, obviously, where a horse might just plod along and do whatever, and I'm being harsh to horses here, I shouldn't really, but a mule might consider the situation a little more and make, place its foot in a different place, and kind of make those decisions based on what's going on around it, with a lot more sense and a lot more kind of background info.
So I've got a question, because my limited experience with horses is having something snuffling in my pocket and being scared for Jesus when it happened. Whether it's a horse or a mule, are they self-reliant to some extent? Do they fuel themselves? Will they go and look for food themselves? It's not a silly question. Will they graze themselves? Will they fuel themselves as they go wherever they can?
Yeah, that was a big issue, was obviously fueling the animals, like you would with a motor vehicle, right? You got to put something in to get them to work hard. And certainly that was a big challenge for the military. So, yes, a horse, if it's if it's let free somewhere, it's going to go off and find a nice patch of grass. But in reality, on the battlefields, that really wasn't often available to them. Usually they were not let loose to sort of kick about and do what they want. And secondly, finding that food was very, very challenging. The amount of fodder that was shipped over to France and Belgium is often quoted as, it's the biggest export. They were shipping over so much fodder from Britain, hay and oats, way more than anything else, because they got to feed the army of horses that are out there to support the men and even feed the men out there, right? Because without horses, you can't get your rations to your blokes.
Yeah. I'm just seeing Ivy's just strolled into the room and sat down. She's interested in what you got to say as well.
Yeah,
legend. Ivy will undoubtedly be in your cartoon for this episode as well. So we talked about cavalry being tiny. We've talked about logistics. We've talked about artillery. Any other major centres of horse employment?
Yeah, I've said that they're kind of involved everywhere, and you can even look at the war industry at home. So if you look at horses, like the Navy, for example, you wouldn't think horses were particularly vital to the Navy in the First World War, but the shipyards, what do you think was moving all the materials around to build the ships? So you've got that, you've got medical side of things, so evacuating the wounded, particularly on Gallipoli. So donkeys were very good there. Donkeys they tolerate the heat.
Didn't the Australians try and give a VC to a donkey at Gallipoli?
There's a lot of nonsense about donkeys in Gallipoli, to be fair.
Yeah, they get far too much of the credit, I feel.
Yeah. But, they were used, mules and donkeys were used in those kind of areas, Macedonian front, Italy, those kind of regions, to evacuate the wounded, because how else are you going to do it? And you've also got things like, you've also got the forestry corps. So, where are you getting your timber to build your trenches? Forestry corps. What's hauling the logs? Horses. it's like you can pretty much circle back round to horses in the First World War wherever you're looking.
So these horses are certainly, they're really earning their pay. But are there any other myths around them that actually drive you insane, things that you hear all the time?
Yeah, there are.
She's like, come on, get on your soapbox.
Get on your hobby horse, come on.
I think probably the biggest one is just really that the army didn't care about the horses. I think whenever we talk about animals in war, it's very emotive, and particularly with horses, there is a thing about horses just generally that kind of really connects with a lot of people. Maybe not you, Merrin. They just terrify you. Just think of them as some kind of jittery, glass-eyed dinosaurs. But
considering she lives in the countryside, it's even more funny.
They have no brakes. I understand you can get them to go faster, but I can never find the brakes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think because of that, because of this emotional connection that we have with horses in our society, that we don't think of them anymore as working animals. That's not their role in our lives anymore. It's changed dramatically over the last 100 years. So when we talk about the First World War and horses, there's this kind of default thing of, well, the army didn't care, all those innocent animals were killed. Much like it plays into, I guess, a lot of the butcher myths that apply to the men as well. And it's kind of that side of it. Well, in reality, actually, they were incredibly valuable, and the British Army were fully aware of that. And in many cases, they cared more for the horses, or they were more valuable than men because they were harder to get hold of at times.
Sorry, Alex, do we know how much they actually spent on horses in the end?
I don't know the total figure, but if you think that it was like 40 million odd was spent just getting them from America, that gives you, some kind of guideline as to how much was spent. But they were limited number. I mean, this is the problem that Germany faced, is because they focused their remount plans on the domestic market and they soon ran out of horses, they then didn't have the kind of vast supply lines that Britain had. Britain was shipping horses from all over the world, from Australia, from South America, from the US, everywhere. Germany, they really only had the horses that were in Germany and then the horses that they were taking in the land as they were kind of progressing throughout the war.
I really want to know, as a total horse moron, what different types of horses do the different jobs? Like, you're not going to have a Shire horse as a cavalry horse, I get that. And the Shire horse is the hairy one, right?
Yeah. My mum's got
my horse knowledge done.
Yeah. So you've got your heavy draft breeds like a Shire horse. So they've got their big feathery legs, so big furry legs, really stocky.
I had a My Little Pony of one of those.
Yes.
That's how what they are.
They are big old bitches. My mum's got one, and they are lovely horses. So the interesting thing about a Shire horse is, yes, they are very strong. They are pussies. They are so gentle. They are quite spooky. They can be quite like loud bangs on the battlefield, and they're very sensitive. Not great war horses, not great, but very good for pulling, heavy guns. Then you've got your light draft horses. So they're stocky, they're muscly. They're not quite as big as a Shire, but they're not your kind of racehorse, skinny kind of cavalry mount that you might think of. And they were really the most important horses. So your light draft was often bred with Shire horse. So you might get like the strains of the strengths coming through in the build of the horse. But you'd get the other characteristics of the slimmer breeds. So you'd get the agility, a bit more speed, bit more nimble, so able to move around a lot. Probably the most important breed, or a breed that's been cited as one of the most important for the Allies throughout the war, is a breed called the Percheron. And they were really incredibly successful just because of the characteristics they have as a breed. So they're very strong in the neck. They are incredibly quick for their size, which is great. And most importantly, they're super chilled. So they will put up with noise going on. They're not bothered. They're really calm. They're quite stoical, and they're smart. So they'll learn quickly.
They're the Dwayne Johnson. They're the Rock of the horse world.
The Rock of the horse world. And if you Google a Percheron and look at them, you can totally see it. And also, the Percheron, I'm getting super nerdy now, but the Percheron doesn't have feathers, so it doesn't have fairy legs, even though it's a stocky breed. So it's easier to look after in the mud. It's easier to clean.
Wait. It doesn't have feathers.
It doesn't have it doesn't have feathers. So not bird feathers, you understand?
Merrin's complete.
Enlighten me here. So far I've got large horses with feathers.
You're going down the whole dinosaur route again now.
The feathers are the long fur that horses get on their legs. So heavier breeds tend to have these long bits of fur on their legs. So yes, Merrin, and for anybody else listening who doesn't know, that's what I'm talking about. Although I love the idea of just Pegasus.
Well, yeah, I want to know, but I had the My Little Pony with the flying ones as well with the plastic wings. So I'm guessing we didn't have any of those.
They don't exist.
No. Sadly, neither do unicorns, which makes me very sad. But what if you put a German Pickelhaube helmet on a horse? Then you kind of have a unicorn.
You do.
Vaguely. I've got a question though. There's a word you use lots of times, and that's different breeds.
Yes.
And because my head's hardwired this way, I want to know about breeding. Did we see foals?
Your head's hardwired to breeding.
Afraid so, yeah.
Checking.
Just checking, yeah.
Lockdown has been difficult on Mary.
Did we have unexpected breeding going on?
No, mainly because breeding horses is a whole thing, and looking after foals is a whole thing, and generally speaking, that's not something you want to be doing in a war zone. Although there are some, there are an odd story or two of foals, usually from where they've come from a French farm or something like that. There's some really lovely photos of foals with the British Army where they've just come across them and they've kept them and they've tried to raise them.
Adopted them, made a mascot out of them, along with every other animal they got their hands on.
So yeah. Were they good for morale then? Did they actually keep them as pets?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an area of the horse and war that's kind of...
Yeah, you gave that in your notes. Why are they so important for morale, and not in terms of just like, oh, isn't it cute, but they're far more well thought out than that as well, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we all know the importance of sport and morale in the First World War, right? So, sport and leisure activities, pretty vital to maintaining morale. They break up the inertia of war, encourage a bit of unit cohesion, kind of a nice leveller among men and officers and all this kind of stuff. And horse shows were pretty central to that. Weirdly, actually, I've got this little kind of medallion on my desk, just for everybody listening. I just happen to have this here, and it's a little First Army Horse Show medal from 1917. It's interesting you mention this, because it's something I'm super interested in. It kind of brought people a bit of connection with their civilian identities. A horse is, it's got this ability to provide a kind of tonic, I guess. It's a weirdly humanizing factor that you get from an animal. Men often became very fond of their horses. They put their needs above their own. So, men, you look in memoirs, you'll often see and read things about men providing shelter, finding food, finding cover for their horses before them. And it was really important, lifting spirits. And the bond between soldier and horse is something that hasn't been studied a great deal, apart from, Jane Flynn has done some really amazing work on that recently. But it's certainly an aspect that's under-researched for sure.
I really want to talk to you about looking after them, because I think our listeners will be surprised to learn that the biggest threat to a horse in the First World War is not a German in a pointy helmet with a gun, it's disease. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And yet again, I'm coming back to Warhorse and all those myths. We see a theme here.
Yeah, he's under fire a remarkable amount of times for a horse.
Isn't it just? Yeah, you got your image of Joey running through explosions left, right and centre, and, the horse the Germans couldn't kill and all of that. Well, yes, obviously, shoot a machine gun at a horse, spray it with bullets, it's going to die. But, in reality, this wasn't a major killer for horses. Shrapnel, big problem, because obviously transport supply lines were a big target. So there was obviously that to be mindful of. But disease, bad conditions, just like men, living in cold, wet conditions for extended periods of time is not good for horses. Many suffered quite severe skin problems, which were very difficult to treat. If you can't get dry, it's very difficult to treat these problems. With horses, their feet and their legs are particularly susceptible. So if you're standing a long time in mud, that's going to be a big issue. And the mud contained bacteria, and this often led to horses going blind, and that was a big problem.
I've got some pictures, actually. I'll tweet these when we put your episode out so that people can see them. Remember those veterinary pictures I tweeted a while back?
Yeah. They're really, really good. And, you know, weirdly, the blindness thing affected mules less so, but for horses it was a big problem. And the other big problem was supplying, and Maren touched on it before, but supplying adequate food and water to the horses. You know what it's like with people. You know, if you don't eat, if you're tired, you're much more likely to get sick. And it's the same with the animals. It's the same with horses. So stories of horses who were just starving because they couldn't get enough to eat, that they were eating their own blankets. You know, they were eating sand in the Middle East.
This is specifically as well really a problem. Like the Germans can't even feed their men by 1918. So their horses were in a right state, weren't they?
It's a massive, massive problem. And horses are... You know, the mules fared much better because they are a bit tougher in that regard. They can cope with kind of rougher conditions and less food, and they can do more with less food. But horses are quite sensitive. And, you know, when a horse gets sick and its spirit broken, then it's working a lot less hard. Horses emotionally, if they're broken, they get depressed, they give up and they die. And, you know, exhaustion was the biggest killer of horses, particularly in 1917.
So they become a drain on resources at that point because you've got to handle their carcasses, surely.
Yeah, and you know the British set up the disposal of animal branch was set up in I think it was 1917 actually, and that dealt specifically with getting rid of the dead horses, because what do you do with them? You can't have them kicking about the battlefield. You know, you can have disease and all kinds of things.
Now, I've got a vague recollection of having heard. Now, you can blow this myth out of the water. Were the carcasses used as like observation posts? So there were soldiers in sort of hiding inside them,
like camo horses.
Yeah,
That I have read a few things of that. Them being used for that. I don't know if it was like an official thing. But they did have, so the disposal of animals branch of the Army Veterinary Corps, that had what they called horse carcass economiser detachments, which is as grim as it sounds. And their job was the disposal of carcasses. So they would butcher the remains and, you know, get the most out of them. So they would use any bits that they could, so that the skins, you know, the hides were sold leather to get a bit more money back in. And they processed something like, you know, 65,000 horses and mules between 1917 and 1918. And that was just that small it was just a small section. But yeah, all kinds of uses. They boiled all their bones up to make, you know, kind of adhesives and all kinds of things, and soaps and all kinds of things.
Did they eat horses? Did they use, I mean, obviously not ill horses, but was there ever a point at which the lack of resources going to the front line meant, well, we've got on the hoof down there, we've got 74 meals?
Yeah. There's definitely been isolated incidents of that. And I think actually the consumption of horses was a bigger kind of cause for concern, and certainly in the public mind after the war, which is something I think we'll chat about a bit later.
I think as well, you've also got situations like the big retreat in Serbia. Horse drops dead, people are falling on it and eating it raw. These people are starving and they're driven through the mountains in the middle of winter. But this is a last resort. It's obviously not in anyone's interest to let a horse die if you can do anything about it. So talk to us about the Army Veterinary Corps. What is the scale of it?
Yeah, so the ABC was it's formed in 1903, but it probably wasn't really up and running until about 1906. You know, weirdly, the care of horses, even though they've been such a big part of warfare for so many centuries, it's kind of not really been centralised up until that point. So they're really looked upon just as replaceable tools, because you didn't have a war.
Is that an offshoot of the Boer War? Because that really was an unmitigated disaster and like a PR nightmare, wasn't it? The horse.
It was. So
it wasn't like, oops, people were outraged.
Yeah, it was a huge thing. There was a whole inquest after the Boer War about horses and their treatment. And, you know, when we talk about the number of horses that you lose in a war, we say the wastage figure, so that's the terminology that we use, and the Boer War was about 67%. So 67% of all the horses and mules and equines that were involved in the war died in the war, were lost.
I mean, that's negligent, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And it was, this is not just to do with, individuals not treating their horses well. This is an institutional problem about not understanding the value of horse care. And so, yeah, after that, the British Army, went through a lot to get to a really good place, basically, the Army Veterinary Corps. And it wasn't easy, because a lot of people were like, well, this isn't important. And you had these kind of key figures who were like, no, it is. I'm working really hard. And so pre-war, we were in quite a good place, the British. And during the First World War, absolutely incredible. The British Army did an amazing job looking after their horses. The wastage figure was around about 14%, which obviously, when you're comparing that to the Boer War, a huge improvement straight off the bat.
Do we have an actual figure for how many horses were conscripted and how many came back at the end?
Yeah, there are figures. It's interesting because you've got kind of all your statistics for where all the different horses are taken from, and it's done in kind of like the annual blocks, and you can kind of roughly work it out. But because of what happened post-war, when they were demobilising the horses, it's quite difficult to tell the exact numbers that were killed. But certainly, the British did an incredible job compared to other nations that were involved. So, Austria had a horse wastage of around 75%. France was about 40%, and Germany was about sort of 35%. So you can see how far ahead really the British Army were with their treatment for horses. They had horse hospitals set up left, right and centre in France, and they pioneered treatment and, the control of disease as well. So they took that really seriously, because contagious diseases in horses is a big problem. You're sticking your sick horses in with your rehabilitating horses, unmitigated disaster. So they were really aware of that and really on top of it. And of course,
you do have scenarios, don't you? Like there's, I don't remember if this was the scenario. There's definitely a place where there's a whole load of horse remains in Gallipoli, but where if you were evacuating, say, Gallipoli, you would just have to slaughter the horses on your way out because you couldn't leave them to the enemy.
Yeah, definitely, because they were so valuable. This is what we're saying, this whole thing. Those were occasions, but there's also again a lot of myths around that. The idea of that's probably one of my most irritating myths, actually. The Anzacs shooting all their horses.
Yeah,
that happened. It didn't happen, because why are you going to shoot horses that are perfectly decent if you can mobilise them and move them out of the area? You're not, because they're so valuable.
And that was one hell of an operation to get the MEF off of Gallipoli, and I don't think they would have just gone, oh yeah, just kill the horses, that's fine.
Yeah, they did have to in Gallipoli.
Yeah.
Some of them they did have to get rid of, for sure. But it wasn't something that, this kind of callous thing was just like, oh, we're done here. Let's just...
Yeah, so we'll just shoot them and then we'll worry about that. It wasn't like that at all, was it?
No, definitely not. And the AVC as well, the Army Veterinary Corps was also responsible for another really important thing, which is farriering and shoeing your horses, which was a huge thing. So, that was a massive thing just in itself. The Quartermaster General Department provided something like 60 million horseshoes during the war. Wow. I mean, it's a staggering number. And I love the quote that's no shoe, no foot, no horse, no transport, no battalion. That pretty much sums up how important horse care and that horse husbandry is in the First World War.
So that goes back into, what did you say, 60 million shoes?
Yeah.
So where do you find the metal for 60 million shoes?
I know. Well, this is it. And you can imagine how much the kind of horse supply and the remount department had to battle in terms of the logistics and all the kind of politics that then came into it when they're talking about the amount of supplies and industry they needed to support the horses. It really impacted and had kind of like branches into all areas of the military.
So if we're talking about looking after horses, and we just said that come the day, there was a tendency to say, well, we've got to get rid of them because the enemy will use them and we don't care about them that much. How did the British stand compared to other nations when it comes to looking after them in general? Were we on par? Were we good at it?
Arguably the best. the French notoriously, I'm probably going to wind so many people up now. There's going to be French historians be like, but the French didn't treat their horses particularly well, unfortunately. The German army did, really, to a degree, because I
think that was more for a want of resources than an actual disregard for your horses. I think German efficiency, if they could have looked after their horses like we did, they would have.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Whereas I think the French just had a different attitude, is the kind of way to put it. But the wastage figures kind of speak for themselves when you consider.
Yeah,
exactly.
Finally, and I say finally, but this is a big one and it's an important one. We all know how complicated it is trying to demobilise massive armies after the war and how much trouble it caused and how long it dragged on for. What about the horses? Because they are a drain on resources. You're going to want them off your hands as soon as possible. What happened?
Yeah, so if you think, you've mobilised all these horses, you've got your 800,000 horses out in the field or whatever it is, and the war ends. Suddenly, you've got a load of horses all over Europe that you don't know what to do with and you have no use for, basically. So the demobilisation was a huge thing, and the welfare of these horses that were no longer fit for military use or no longer required. And when we talk about these horses, we say cast horses, so they were cast. And that really pulled on the heartstrings of the British public. And actually, it's not the British Army's finest hour, but it was a really difficult thing because you had debates around the kind of the practical side of things and then the sentimental side of things.
Yeah, and life had to get back to normal.
Life had to get back to normal. Getting men home had to be a priority, not horses. And, realistically, what's available in terms of moving horses back, quarantining them, all those kind of things, it's very difficult to do. So they had a process of categorising animals. So horses got categorised A to D, and horses that were categorised as D, they were ones that could no longer work, were over a certain age, were perhaps badly injured or in bad condition, and they were destroyed basically quite quickly, and that was really just to aid in just getting all these horses out and about. If the ones that you can't save and are going to need a lot of work, better to destroy those and focus on the animals that can be resold, can be shipped home, can be made use of somewhere else, basically, in order to save as many as possible.
Pretty tough call, though, if you've got to be the man who's got to sort it out.
Yeah, it was, and it was never going to be a popular thing. So a lot of the other animals, so the category A to C animals, they kind of had different fates. Some of them were repatriated, a few of them were. Many of them were sold on the continent. Some did end up, selling a horse in France. That might not end up, working too long. It might end up on your plate somewhere. And it was a big problem. We think about it now, it kind of makes us wince a bit. All these animals that worked their backsides off in the war for us, and then we sold them, and some of them got, particularly in the Middle East, it was a big problem, just because of the cultural differences between how they view animals. Some of them were treated quite poorly after the war. Arguably, they had a better life in the army in the war than they did afterwards. And Dorothy Brooke famously set up her charity to help ex-war horses in Egypt. You might have heard of the Brooke Foundation. It's still going today. Yeah. They still support all the kind of working horses and donkeys across the world. And it was a big thing. It was a big thing in British society, that the plight of these war horses, charities, the RSPCA, the Blue Cross, who, worth noting, they were pretty central and involved in horse care throughout the war. The Army Veterinary Corps couldn't have been as successful as it was without those charities as well. And they appealed to people for donations to help these ex-war horses. And then you kind of get into this whole field of the veteranization of horses after the war, which is something for another day, but again, a really interesting area to look at.
It's so British as well, isn't it? That arguably there's guys begging on the street who fought in the army, and there's people going schizo over the plight of the horses. That's such a British thing.
It is, definitely.
I was just going to say, we're light years on from the Industrial Revolution, but as far as I can understand, horses were embedded in culture still. They were integral to the way we lived still. I mean, certainly here in East Anglia, it would have been horses first, not horsepower, not mechanized horsepower. So the importance of bringing them back or maintaining the sense of integrity to looking after them, at least stood us in good stead.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the reasons that they didn't bring back, they had to really carefully balance how many horses were repatriated was because if they brought back loads, it would have flooded the market in the UK, which would have been really detrimental to the economy, because horses and the breeding and selling of horses was a very big part of the economy still, because they were part of the workforce.
I've learned so much.
Got to ask you as well. Let's ask her this before she goes, Merrin. Joey gets all the bloody damned attention, doesn't he? Are there famous real horses that you want to give a shout out to? The only one I can think of is the one Haig's one that sat on the king. But the king was adamant that even though he nearly died, no one should punish the horse, and the horse should not be put down or anything. And there is a photo of the horse back on ceremonial outside Buckingham Palace. So
that's amazing. I haven't heard that.
Yeah, there's a picture of her outside Buckingham Palace because the king said it's not her fault.
Shifty in the middle.
Shifty in the middle, yeah. There are loads of really lovely stories of individual horses. I'll probably quick shout out to the Old Blacks. They were a team of gun horses. They served throughout the war, so they went out with the original BEF, stayed out in France till 1918. All of them survived, had injuries, but they all survived, and they came back and they were pretty much horse celebrities, and they actually supposedly pulled the wagon with the unknown warrior on when it went to Westminster Abbey. So they were pretty famous. And then my other one is Tiny the donkey. There are some amazing photos of Tiny the donkey. And he was a foal that was found lying by the roadside by the 26th Divisional Train of the Army Service Corps. And they adopted him and he became their mascot. This is all during the Soroka campaign. And he used to wander freely around their camp and was apparently obsessed with drinking tea. So he used to drink up to 9 cups of tea in succession, apparently. So, yeah.
Good English little horse. I have to tell you now that your presence has not just been requested, it's been demanded by the kids of the Great War Group, who want their next session to be on animals in the war, and they want you to tell them all about horses and pigeons randomly.
Just pigeons, yeah, sure. We love a pigeon story.
Yeah. This is the 8 to 12-year-olds. They desperately want you to come and talk to them all about horses and stuff. So.
Happy to do so.
But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about war horses. It's been brilliant. Maybe come back and talk to us about cavalry action. I know you've been working on some for the Great War Group.
Love to.
Because you've written an article. Did you cover the Australian light horse?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's some, there is some really good, for all the trashing Allenby gets as a general on the Western Front, does rather well in Palestine when he can run his cavalry out in a much more traditional way. So you should come back and tell us all about it.
Love to. We chat Bathsheba.
Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join... There's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org. where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/hack history, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great